All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Valentin Pereda, who is an assistant professor at the School of Criminology at the University of Montreal. Dr. Pereda's research focuses on organized crime, Southern criminology, extra-legal regulation, drug trafficking, and criminal violence. So, Dr. Pereda, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Ben.
So, when did you first get interested in criminology?
That's a good question. Just to put a little bit of context, when I started my undergraduate degree in Mexico City, there was this unfolding crisis taking place in Mexico. So, as you know, right now Mexico is going through this unprecedented crisis of criminal violence. It's become one of the most violent countries in the world in terms of criminal violence, like homicide, drug-related violence. But when I grew up, like I'm a millennial, so like when I grew up in the 90s, it wasn't the case. So I mean, everybody knew that Mexico had problem with drug trafficking and that there was violence related to criminal organizations. But for the most part, Mexico was considered as a like safe place. You could, like do tourism pretty much anywhere. There were places that were considered like a little bit more dangerous, but nothing compared to what's going on right now. And that was, like when I was a kid and when I was a teenager in Mexico. And then when I started my undergraduate degree in political science in Mexico City, all of a sudden things started to change. So at the turn of the century, two things happened. First, Mexico became a democratic country. So at the beginning, there was this fascination, especially by political scientists, with this process of democratization taking place in Mexico. So a lot of the debates in the early 21st century focused on these processes of democratization and also integration with the other countries in North America. So a lot of researchers were focused on how Mexico was becoming more and more intertwined with the US and with Canada in terms of economic exchanges, but also in terms of immigration patterns, in terms of like industrial production patterns. Um, so a lot of the conversations when I started my undergrad, we focused on that. And then I would say like beginning in 2003, but like very clearly as of 2006, 2007, there started this other phenomena taking place, which had to do with the sudden increase in violence by non-state actors that we know popularly as the Mexican cartels. So a lot of the researchers were initially focused on these processes of democratization and economic and political integration within North America. Had to, because like they had no choice. It was like it became a priority. Had to change gears and change like their direction a little bit and focus on this other big issue that was starting taking place concerning the rise in criminal violence and the rise in drug-related violence. So this took place as I was undertaking my undergraduate studies, and a lot of the professors who taught me at the time kind of changed their focus and started studying these phenomena related to criminal violence and invited me to participate in their research projects. At that time, I was looking at this violence through the lens of political science, not necessarily through the lens of criminology, but we did treat that as instances of criminal violence. And this is when I started to focus on what was going on in Mexico from this perspective of crime and violence. So that was a very long answer to say it was during my early years as an undergraduate student in Mexico City.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So, really, I guess sort of the domestic issues going on in Mexico kind of shaped your career then and your interest, um, which I guess makes a lot of sense because when you have a change in a country like that, I suppose that really sticks in people's minds as wow, this is something that I need to investigate more and look into to see what's going on. Um, so, how exactly did the drug cartels in Mexico sort of become so powerful where, now people are talking about sort of cartel issues regularly in Mexico?
Um, so That's also a very interesting question, and there's no simple answer to it. So there are a lot of different factors which contributed to the growth of the cartels in terms of economic power, in terms of military power and political power. Um, by now, most researchers concur that there are 5 to 6 factors that are the main explanatory factors behind the growth in the power of the cartels. So if you want, I can provide you like
Yeah.
a list of those factors that have been identified. Uh, so to begin with, there's this consensus within researchers that throughout the 20th century, as I mentioned earlier, Mexico was not a democratic state. It was an autocratic state governed by one political party known as PRI in Spanish. So PRI, so that's the acronym of Partido de la Revolución Institucional, which was the party that emerged after the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. So the PRI controlled Mexico for almost 70 years as an autocratic party that controlled the entire country through a system of clientelism and patronage, meaning that the party would negotiate deals with local politicians in exchange for favors and in exchange for like a reciprocal kind of relationship. So many of these deals were extra legal or illegal, but that was the way that the party managed to establish control over this country in the post-revolutionary context. And one of the actors with whom the PRI had an indirect relationship with was drug cartels or drug traffickers at the time. So the deal during the 20th century was quite simple. There was one single party that controlled the entire country, and the party decided that it was going to tolerate the activities of drug trafficking and criminal organizations. The deal was in very short in very short terms. You can do certain criminal activities such as drug trafficking as long as one, you provide us with a share of the revenues, so you need to like give us some kickbacks, and two, you need to abide by some rules. So like these are simple rules. First, you kind of do violence whenever you want. You kind of just like attack whoever you want. You need to like keep it discreet. You need to try to be as inconspicuous as possible. You cannot attack government employees, and you need to essentially recognize that in the end, it is the government that rules over the country, not you, and
Mm-hmm.
you need to abide by the rules of the government. So since there was this like pretty, like asymmetrical relationship between this like huge, powerful, unique party that controlled the whole government, like you and the whole country. You can take, like kind of like right now in certain countries like China or Russia, where you have like
Right.
one big party that has like a very strong control over the whole country. Like criminal organizations were really like overpowered
Mm-hmm.
by this party and had no choice but to abide. So in criminology and political science, this phenomenon is known as the state-sponsored protection, meaning that the government was acting as kind of like a protection racket, offering protection to criminals in exchange for a share of the revenues and abiding by some rules.
Yeah.
But what happened in 2000 is that this system broke down when Mexico became a democracy. And all of a sudden, you had a bunch of different parties, like opposing parties, competing for political control, not just over the federal government, because Mexico has a federal political structure, just like the US and Canada. So not over just the federal government, but also over state governments and over
Okay.
municipal governments. So all of a sudden, you could have one city that was controlled by one party, one state that was controlled by a different party, and then the whole country, like the federal government, that was being managed by another party. So it became very difficult, or just like it became impossible for this system to survive in a democratic context in which you couldn't have this alignment between just like this one big powerful actor trying to discipline criminal organizations. So that was part of of what happened. Then secondly, at the same time, in the early 90s, well, like in the end of the 20th century, I would say like there were other factors that took place. One was also like that Mexico signed a free trade agreement with the US
Okay.
and with Canada, which essentially opened the doors for trade like to come in from Mexico into the United States, meaning that all of a sudden the amount of goods and the amount of people
Yeah.
crossing every day from Mexico into the US just grew exponentially, meaning that there was a much bigger opportunity for legal goods to cross the border, but also for
Right.
illegal goods to
Yeah.
cross the border. And when you have this huge demand for certain drugs that are being produced in Mexico and in South America and sometimes in other parts of the world, and you have like this big door that allows you to come in, even if you try to control what's coming in, you're not going to be able to control everything that is crossing,
Yeah.
especially when you have I believe I don't have the exact figures here with me, but the Mexico-US border is the busiest border in the world in terms of traffic, like the amount of trucks coming in every day, the amount of people crossing every day. So there's this like huge trade taking place, like
Yeah.
like this like huge river of goods, you know, like coming from and to and from the US. And within this like huge flow of legal goods, there are also illegal goods such as drugs and
Yep.
such as weapons that are, you know, like also crossing the border. This happened in the context when a few years earlier in the late 80s and the early 90s, uh, some of the main producers of one very popular drug in the world known as cocaine in Colombia decided that it was no longer effective to try to run the entire chain of supply from Colombia into the US and decided to outsource part of that business to the Mexican cartels. So essentially, the Colombians in the 70s and in the early 80s were running the whole business, like cocaine business from Colombia, going through the Caribbean and inserting cocaine shipments into the US through the Florida coast.
Yeah.
So that's the context where the like TV shows such as Miami Vice and like movies such as Scarface were produced when, you know, like Miami was this, you know, like city of vice where you had like all these Colombian and Cuban criminal organizations
Yeah.
fighting for control over cocaine distribution routes. Um, in the 80s, the US decided to crack down, like under the Ronald Reagan administration, started to crack down on this corridor, like trafficking corridor known as the Caribbean route. And all of a sudden, Colombian traffickers realized that, well, like if they wanted to introduce cocaine into the US, they had to find another more effective route. And they realized that there was this like country that shared this huge border with the US, Mexico, and that they could ask those criminal organizations who were already there to help them introduce cocaine into Mexico. At the same time, during that same period, the US started extraditing Colombian drug lords into the US to be judged and sentenced in the United States. And so the Colombians said, like, you know, like maybe it would be safer if we take a distance, if we try to, you know, like establish some sort of buffer between us, the cocaine producers, and the
Yeah.
clients in the US. Who could provide this, like, you know, like middle, you know, like who could be the middleman? Who could provide this buffer between us and the clients in the US? Again, the Mexican cartels. Because if we tell them, okay, here's the cocaine, now it's your responsibility to introduce it into US soil and to sell it there, then we can just say, like, we're just here in Colombia. We're not
Right.
exporting drugs into the US. That's the Mexican cartels who are doing that. They're just coming to Colombia, buying the cocaine, and then exporting it into the US. That's not our fault. And that was a way for them to try to limit the chances of being arrested and then extradited into the US. Like, try to distance themselves as much as possible from what was taking place in the United States. Um, so that's another factor. Also, it's important to know that at the same time, as Mexico was, like signing this free trade agreement and becoming a democratic country, Mexico embraced a policy of economic development that was essentially based on the principles of neoliberalism. So essentially, it was, like, we believe in free markets. We believe in, like pulling yourself from your bootstraps and, like, like self-made men. So we're gonna open the doors, like, to just, like, like firms, like big firms. And then what that created is, yes, in fact, like a huge economic growth, but at the same time, a big increase in economic inequality in the
Yeah.
country. So all of a sudden, poverty rates started, like growing. A lot of communities that used to be, like middle class communities started, like plunging into poverty. And all of a sudden, you had like all these communities where you had young, like especially young men who, like just wanted to find a way of, like living, and wanted to find new opportunities. And in some contexts, the only people who were hiring and who were providing opportunities were not, like legitimate enterprises that were providing, like decent salaries, but were actually criminal enterprises that were saying, well, like if you want a way out of poverty, we can offer you that. Like we can offer you, like this dream that is being sold to you now, like kind of like the American
Yeah.
dream
Yeah.
transposed into Mexico, where, like you can become your own, like a successful you're like your own successful success, like sorry, like your own successful entrepreneur. Just, like you have to be ruthless, and you have to be willing, like to break the rules as well.
Sure.
um then it's important to mention that Mexico has historically had very deficient um, criminal justice institutions.
Hmm.
And with this phenomenon taking place, like all of a sudden, like uh, growth in drug trafficking, growth in like cocaine coming into the U.S. from Mexico, which was lining the pockets of Mexican cartels because they were taking all this revenue from cocaine coming from Colombia. This rising inequality, within Mexican society, you start having more, like more and more crime, but Mexican institutions can't really handle that because they traditionally, like historically, have been very ineffective. Essentially, during the 20th century, when you had this authoritarian regime controlling the country, like the wasn't like it wasn't one of the priorities of the regime to make sure that you had like well functioning and fair criminal justice system.
Sure.
The idea was like you're either like a citizen that like behaves according to what the regime expects, or like you can just like essentially take it to prison. And like the Mexico had this justice system based on the Spanish Inquisition. Essentially, it's called an inquisitorial system in which you're not, like in the U.S., you're innocent until proven
Right.
guilty. In Mexico, it was the other way around. It's
Okay.
you're guilty and you have to demonstrate that you're actually innocent. So you could be arrested, sent to prison, then the attorney or the attorney, like the representative of the attorney general would show up with like this file saying like this is all like the evidence that we have gathered against you, and now it's your responsibility to disprove this evidence,
Yeah.
otherwise you're going to stay in prison. So Mexico, in 2008, adopted a system that is more akin to the criminal justice system in the U.S., an accusatorial system in which you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but it hasn't really worked because there are not enough resources to make it work. And uh, until now, like the crime rates in Mexico, and like the rate at which this crime is being addressed by law enforcement institutions and by criminal justice institutions is just appalling. I think that more than 95% of homicides in Mexico go unsolved. So if you
Yeah.
go to Mexico and you get killed, there's a
It's
95% chance that no one will
wow.
ever know who killed you, and nobody will be arrested for the crime. And even if somebody is arrested for the crime, there are also these like huge chances that it's not actually the right person, that
Yeah.
is just like some like corrupt police officer decided that, well, like we could just like fabricate some evidence against this chum over here and let's put it in prison and then case solved. and like will look good, and then like this person that we don't really care about will just like rot in prison. Um, so lastly, and this is very important to mention because like it has become something that is more and more studied in the last years, but for the last decade or so, it was like usually neglected in most analysis of this phenomenon. You have to remember that in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, the assault weapons ban in the US came to an end.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, in the US, and especially in certain states in the south of the US, it was possible again to go and purchase military grade weaponry and without much problems. And like in the US, there's a huge debate around this.
Yeah.
But in Mexico, we have another debate taking place around this, which is that the impact that like this policy change has had in the US is that it has also become much easier for criminal organizations in Mexico to go into the US and buy military grade weaponry, bring it back to Mexico using the same routes that are being used to export drugs, and then use them either just like to intimidate like the
Hmm.
innocent people, to fight against criminal competitors, or even to fight against the government, including the military. So when I talk about like this military grade weaponry, yes, of course, I'm talking about like pistols, but also assault rifles.
Yeah.
In the 90s, this is kind of like interesting actually. In the 90s, the like narcos, like drug traffickers in Mexico, for them, like the best weapon you could have, like, and it demonstrated that you were a very successful criminal, was a Kalashnikov rifle, an AK-47.
Okay.
So it was pretty hard to get one. So it was like if you could afford to like purchase an AK-47, it was like, whoa, look at this dude. Like he must be like a real narco because he has this like gold-plated
Yep.
AK-47. But that has changed now. Like now nobody talks about those. Now it's AR-15 rifles that
Yeah.
are like the
Yeah.
most sought after by sicarios, by criminal organizations in Mexico. And also another rifle that has become almost like emblematic of the rock of the Mexican cartels are Barrett rifles, like 50. I think it's I'm not an expert in
Sure.
small
Sure.
arms, but it's like 50 cal Barrett rifles, which are rifles that are not meant to kill people, but are meant to destroy vehicles. So it's not an anti-personnel rifle. It's like an anti-vehicle
Yeah.
weapon that is used. Like it can be used against Humvees, against jeeps, against boats, and against helicopters. And the Mexican cartels have used them very successfully against police helicopters and military helicopters to shoot them down whenever operations take place in Mexico to crack down against the cartels or try to capture one of their leaders.
Right.
So that covers the list. Maybe I missed something, but like it's kind of like part of this perfect storm that of factors that took place all at once, like at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st. So in the last decade of the 20th century, you were already seeing like some of these patterns emerging, but everything consolidated between 2000 and 2007 to have this like perfect combination of factors that just triggered this massive conflict between criminal organizations that were becoming super powerful and also between the government and criminal organizations. So usually I'm not a big fan of like I don't usually defend like, the Mexican government, like
Hmm.
independently of the administrations. I think that all parties have done a terrible job in handling the crisis of cartel violence. I think that some people tend to be overly critical of what President Felipe Calderon did in 2007, which is launch this massive crackdown on criminal organizations. I think that the fault wasn't entirely his. Like as I mentioned, like all these other factors came into
Yeah.
play and exacerbated the situation. But it is also important to mention that like he just decided to deploy this kind of like huge crackdown on criminal organizations without a strategy, without knowing what he was getting himself and the entire country into, just by launching these like massive raids and like deploying the military and deploying the police against the cartels without even having like a like or a long-term strategy of like, okay, so we're gonna like put soldiers on the streets. We're just like gonna massively arrest people, and then what? Like, what's gonna happen? How
Yeah,
are we gonna ensure that like they're just not gonna like recruit other people, or that they're not just like gonna arm themselves better, or that like they won't have revenues to keep funding their activities? None of those things were addressed at the time. It was just like, I have this idea. Let's put soldiers on the street and make them make arrests, and like this show these like like very kind of like theatrical operations with helicopters and masked soldiers where we go and conduct raids in the like the ranches or like the mansions of drug lords. Okay, but then what? There was no strategy whatsoever. It was
sure.
just like, and then well, like we'll just keep doing it forever and ever. It hasn't worked. It has just exacerbated violence. So it wasn't entirely the fault of the Calderon administration, as some critics like pointed out at the time and even now. But like let's just say that it was a very short-sighted strategy that has only backfired in many ways.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great overview that you gave of the situation, and I think there's a few really interesting things that you point out that I think, especially people in the U.S. kind of take for granted. But the Mexican and American relationship with the drug problem, the countries are so connected. I mean, in so many ways. Obviously, drug cartels make so much money because of the demand coming from the United States. Um, and so I think that oftentimes in American politics, we look at the issue solely from the perspective, okay, Mexico needs to fix this. While in the US, we're the ones buying all the drugs. And then of course you point out, as I've heard before, about the amount of weapons being brought into Mexico, which gives all the muscle to support these drug operations. Um, it really is incredible because in so many ways, the United States and Mexico and the issues these societies are facing are very much intertwined, and the countries are contributing to each other's problems when it comes to the drug cartel situation.
So they are completely intertwined, and it has been the case since the beginning. I'm not a historian, and there have been some like fascinating studies like conduct that have been published, and like histories of the drug cartels and like the history of the criminal organizations in Mexico. And since the beginning, the problem has been a problem uh, that has included both Mexico and the U.S. Since like the 1920s, where when Mexican criminal organizations were mainly focused on in the production of opium, like just like opium in the Sinaloan mountain range. A lot of that opium was being exported into the United States, and there's this story, but I don't know if it has been verified through like empirical evidence, if there has been enough archival research conducted on this specific story, but some historians point out that it was during the Second World War that the Mexican cartel started becoming powerful because the U.S. had a lot of soldiers deployed in Europe and in Asia, and a lot of those soldiers were getting wounded and they needed morphine, like just
Hmm.
like to
Okay.
be able to like to deal with like their wounds in the battleground. And at that in that moment of time, it was very hard to get morphine that comes from opium from places such as China, Afghanistan, or Turkey. So Mexico was a safe place for the US government to go and get the necessary ingredients to produce morphine. So at the time, some historians say that the US government, either officially or unofficially, kind of like gave like this permission for Mexican farmers growing opium
Hmm.
within the Sinaloan
Yeah.
mountain range to grow opium and to export that into the U.S. so it could be transformed into morphine and sent to the battlegrounds in Europe and in Asia. Again, like this story has been contested by some people, saying like, well, there's no evidence that the
Hmm.
U.S. actually like authorized the Mexican opium farmers to do this, but kind of like in the local history, like the local like folk history in
Sure.
Mexico, it's kind of like something that is oftentimes repeated as well. Like it was during the Second World War that the U.S. need for morphine to treat its wounded soldiers, kind of like gave this incentive for Mexican opium farmers to start growing more and more produce to send into the US.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, like from the 1930s, 1940s, it was already kind of like a problem involving both countries. And now, like, of course, like you cannot understand what's taking place in Mexico without understanding what's taking place in the US and vice versa, right? So like
Yeah.
the the crisis related to opiates in the US is also like tightly intertwined with what is taking place in Mexico. So yeah, you're totally right on that.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the need for effective governance and cooperation between the two countries to ever solve such a complex problem. Thinking about the amount of territorial control of the drug cartels in Mexico, how much, so like, what does that look like in Mexico in terms of, the places they're operating out of? And, are they just controlling particular villages, or is it like swaths of territory, or what?
Well, this is an interesting question because if you think like if you think of the cartels as violent non-state actors, entities that like are armed and are able to impose their own rules, like their own order into specific communities or like into specific spaces, then I would say that yeah, yes, there are certainly places in Mexico, like especially like rural places, like places in the mountains, that are like entirely controlled by criminal organizations, meaning that they either have like armed men, like controlling who comes in, who goes out, etc., or they pay local police, like especially municipal police officers, to do that job for them. It's like, okay, so like you're the like the municipal police of this small village that like of like a few thousand residents. You're working for me and you're gonna do whatever I tell you. Like I'm gonna pay you, and I'm also not gonna kill you and your relatives if you cooperate with me. So there are certain places in Mexico where you can actually like see this taking place. Like I'm thinking, for instance, of rural context, like rule settings in Sinaloa, like the state where El Chapo comes from. Uh, if you go to like the mountain ranges, there are places that are just like controlled entirely by the cartels. However, the cartel's control over Mexico is more complex than that. It's more complicated. Sometimes it won't take this shape of like literally actually like physically going with somebody who's holding a gun and saying, this is cartel territory, we control this space.
Yeah.
It's more subtle. So cartel influence will, like will manifest itself in other ways. Like as I mentioned earlier, corruption. It can be something like, well, um, over here, I know that like the army works for like the federal government, but I can bribe soldiers, I can bribe officers, and tell them, well, like you can keep your job, like you don't have to work for me full time, but I'm gonna give you some incentives, like financial incentives, to from time to time, like let me know if there's gonna be an operation against you, for instance. There are markets like that are controlled, like physical markets that are like indirectly controlled by criminal organizations that say people who sell their goods here need to pay the criminal organization in order to be able to like open businesses and conduct businesses like in a normal way. If you don't pay the cartel, like if you don't pay us like regular fees, then somebody's gonna show up to your place and we're gonna threaten you, we're gonna beat you, we're gonna kidnap you, or like maybe we can
Yeah.
even kill you. There are other markets in the more abstract term, like not like physical places, but I'm like in the economic sense of the term, like such as like the cocaine market, for instance, or like the market of for like human organs that are also controlled by the cartels, in the sense that they will set up rules such as who can take part in these markets. If you're going to sell, for instance, cocaine, what's the quality of the cocaine that you need to sell? If you're going to sell it, you can only sell it here. You can only sell it in these specific villages or in these specific cities. And you have to do it with the authorization of these local, like local cartel representative, and you need to pay him or her a regular fee in order to be able to operate. So this whole concept in academia is known as governance, and specifically criminal governance or illegal governance, which is the ability of criminal organizations to impose rules and control individuals. Essentially, don't hesitate to interrupt me if I'm just like
No, no,
monopolizing the
you're.
conversation.
I'm keeping notes in my head about further questions. So, yeah,
All right.
continue. Yeah.
So essentially, what researchers have discovered is that this criminal governance can take three different shapes. The first one is criminal organizations who set rules to control the behavior of their own members. So you belong to the Sinaloa cartel, you need to behave in a certain way. Some of the rules that they sometimes impose is you cannot be drinking during the day. You cannot use drugs when you're working for us. You need to be, you need to be able to respond to, you need to be able to perform. You cannot abuse the local community, especially there are bans on like things such as sexual assaults. Like we need to keep our reputation, so our employees are prohibited from engaging in certain kinds of behavior that look bad, such as sexually assaulting somebody or just like petty extortion, things like that. So that's the first level of criminal governance, meaning a criminal organization that is going to set rules to control the behavior of its own members. If you belong to this criminal organization, you need to abide by these rules. And it can go like all the way into like you need to wear a uniform, kind of like you as you would see in a legitimate enterprise. Like if you work for, I don't know, like Starbucks, like you need to wear a uniform.
Yeah.
Sometimes like some criminal organizations will say, well, you work for us, like you need to wear a uniform. Some things like that I've heard is like you cannot wear tennis shoes, for instance. You need to
Yeah.
wear like certain kind of like shoes that are like gonna allow you to move fast if you need to, like, or that like it's gonna look more professional, or it's gonna be looking more intimidating, like such as military boots or like combat boots.
Yeah.
The second level of criminal governance is termed like market governance. So that means criminal organizations will set rules to control the activities taking place in specific markets. And here again, I'm talking about markets in the abstract sense of the term, such as the cocaine market, the market for stolen cars, for instance. So, oh, you want to steal cars? That's fine, but there are rules. You cannot steal whoever's car. There are some models that you can steal, some others that you cannot steal. If you're going to steal cars, you need to sell them to this client who's going to ship them into Dubai, for instance. If you want to sell cars, you need the authorization of this local crime lord who will get a fee for the authorization to steal cars within the territory that he controls. So those are rules that I'm just like giving you some examples of rules that criminal organizations may impose to control markets, like who can participate in certain markets, what kind of behavior is allowed if you want to participate in a specific market. Let's say, for instance, that tomorrow you decide to become a cocaine trafficker and move to Mexico. Well, you're not going to be able to do it if you don't abide by the rules of those who control that market in
Right.
Mexico already. So they may say, oh, okay, Ben, like you want to be exporting cocaine into the US, into Indiana? You can do it, but you need to pay regular fees to the local Sinaloa cartel representative in Mexico. You need to use our drug shipment routes. You need to guarantee that your drug is going to be a certain quality. You need to package your cocaine in a certain kind of container that will minimize chances of being detected in the border. You need to follow these rules. if you want to participate in this market. So that's the second level, market governance. And then the third level is called community governance. And that's what you see oftentimes in Latin America. Like that's like the most visible, that's most visible in developing countries that have relatively weaker institutions, like especially law enforcement and criminal justice institutions. By community governance, researchers refer to the ability of criminal organizations to impose rules on the communities where they operate. So these can be crazy. Like, for instance, during the pandemic in Mexico, some criminal organizations decided that it was going to be them who were going to enforce like
Oh, yeah.
health
COVID.
regulations
Yeah.
within parts of the country. So it was like, so this territory is controlled by the Sinaloa cartel. People need to wear masks. And if you don't wear masks, you're not going to be visited by, I don't know, like a health representative. You're going to be visited by a cartel sicario who's going to say, you're not respecting the rules. Everybody's wearing masks. You need to do it. Otherwise, we're going to beat you, or like we're going to
Right.
just like threaten you or threaten your family. So like one of the most blatant examples again was recently during the pandemic, where the cartels in Mexico and like in other countries, also in Brazil, for instance, criminal organizations in the favelas in Brazil decided to that they were going to be the authorities, like imposing regulations to mitigate the effects of the coronavirus, such as there's a curfew, like you cannot leave your house after certain hours, you cannot go to a bar because like you're going to infect other people. So that those were criminal organizations imposing those rules. In non-pandemic context, you can talk about, like sometimes they will impose some rules such as, well, like this is a school district and it looks bad if we sell drugs here. So it's prohibited for anybody to sell drugs in this district because it's going to give us a bad reputation. Oftentimes, these rules that they impose on the community are meant to like promote a reputation, such as, look at us, we're not so bad. We
Yeah.
like we can provide order, we can provide security, but also we're safeguarding our interests. Like sometimes like this is something that you see more in countries that have stronger law enforcement institutions. Sometimes regulations on the community will be manifested like within, for instance, a specific building, like a housing project, for instance, where the criminal organization will say like, there's a law of silence. Nobody is allowed to talk to the police. If there's a crime and the police comes and starts asking questions, nobody can cooperate with the police because over here it's us who decide who gets punished and why and when. So in Mexico, you see that as well. They impose rules on like whether or not you can talk to the police, whether or not you can even call the police if you're the victim of a crime, or if you have to actually call a representative of the local cartel so that they will decide whether or not they will help you. So that's the third level of governance. So what I'm trying to say here is that like cartel power in Mexico manifests itself in like these complex ways in which you will not always necessarily see a person with like with a balaclava, like with a mask and an assault rifle saying this is cartel territory.
Right.
Sometimes the power is more subtle. And this reminds me a few years ago, like actually more like 5 years ago, I was invited to participate in a documentary that was filmed by a crew of journalists from Toronto. And we traveled to Playa del Carmen. And like we were just like walking in the most touristic street of Playa del Carmen, and it was crowded with tourists from like all over the world, like from Mexico, the US, from Canada, from Europe. And the journalist asked me, like, so like here, like we're in the middle of the most touristic street of Playa del Carmen, like near Cancun. Are the cartels present here? And I was like, yeah, of course they are. Like you can, like if you pay attention to what's going on, like in the bars, in the nightclubs, in the hotels, cartels are imposing their own rules, like their interests
Yeah.
in those spaces, even if you're not seeing them doing it, right, like right in front of your eyes. Like it's just like it's more subtle.
Wow, that is crazy. Um, but I guess yeah, that kind of makes sense because you can sort of see operations like that in, I guess, a lot of different countries around the world that have kind of loose federal governance over territories where criminal organizations kind of take control. I mean, so like, would you see something like that? For example, I know a hot tourist spot, at least historically for Americans, is like Cancun or something. Would you see you could see cartels operating there in the shadows a bit as well?
Of course, I mean, I can tell you like even a personal story. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a close relative who used to work as a human resources representative for one of the big international hotels in Cancun. So I'm talking about the kind of hotels like all inclusive, where you oftentimes see like families from Canada, from the US going for spring break, or like from like during
Yeah.
winter. So he worked as an HR like as head of human resources in that hotel, and at one point this happened like I think it was 5 6 years ago. He started getting some complaints from some customers who were saying, some of your employees are dealing drugs within the hotel premises. Like they are offering like cocaine and like synthetic drugs, like like party drugs. And like that's not cool. Like this is not what we're paying for. Like we don't feel safe. You need to do something about it. So my relative started receiving these complaints, and he was advised by like the board of like managers of this hotel. It's a hotel, international hotel chain, to do something, like to take matters into his hands, right? So he said, well, let's contact the police. So he called the police, and they said, okay, we're gonna set a sting operation. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna send like undercover agents to your hotel, and they're going to stay in your hotel for like about a week or two, and during this time they're going to pretend that they're just like regular customers, and they're going to ask if they can purchase drugs, like from different employees, and they're going to like make this list of all the employees who are selling drugs within hotel premises. So my relative said, okay, that's fine. Let's do that. So the operation took place, and by the end of the operation, police officers came and told him, like, here's a list of the people within the hotel who are peddling drugs within hotel premises. So do with this list whatever you want.
Yeah.
So he talked to his supervisors, and he said, like, well, like, you have to fire them. Like there's like there's no other way. So he fired all these employees, but that was no solution at all, because just a few months after that, the same thing started happening. So my relative started the whole process again, like trying to pinpoint who was selling drugs within the hotel and firing them one by one, until one day, one of the employees told him, like, the problem what you're doing is that we're not really given a choice. Like we're told by the cartels, you either sell drugs within the hotel or you're gonna face consequences. We're
Hmm.
gonna threaten you. We're gonna beat you up. We're gonna like eventually kill you, or like do something to your relative. So like we don't have much of a choice here. And my relative said, well, like I don't have much of a choice either. I can't just let you run a drug business within the hotel.
Yeah.
So he kept firing employees until one day one employee said, okay, so I have a message for you. It's a message from the cartel saying you need to stop doing this because you're messing with their business.
Yeah.
They're not happy about it, and if you keep firing employees, then you're gonna be seen as the main problem, and they're gonna kill you.
Yeah.
So my relative had to quit. Like
Yeah.
there was no option for him. He was facing this dilemma. Like he told me,
Yeah.
like I could either just like turn a blind eye to what's happening, and I couldn't possibly do that, or I could just quit because I was like I felt threatened and I
Right.
felt
Sure.
vulnerable. So he just left, and he was unemployed for several years. So that's just an example of how like the cartels infiltrate spaces in places such as Cancun, Playa del Carmen, like in the Mayan Riviera. You see that Baja as well. Like all these places that are seen as like fancy
Right.
resorts in different parts of Mexico. They are by far infiltrated by cartel interests. It's just that you
Yeah.
don't see them
Sure.
you don't see them operating like blatantly because it's not in their best interest. Like they wanna protect their interests, and part of that is like we don't want to scare off American tourists. We don't want to scare off Canadian tourists. Like they bring money, they bring business, they keep coming back. Like let's keep them happy. Let's keep them coming back.
That's right.
But in order
Yeah.
to do that, we need to guarantee, for instance, that they're not gonna be like as far as we can control, like they're not gonna be like firefights taking place right in front of the hotels. Like they're not gonna be like people getting kidnapped right in front of an all-inclusive, because that will scare tourists away. So
Yeah.
in places such as Cancun, there are also these concerted efforts by the cartels to keep violence inconspicuous because they don't want to scare tourists. They want to
Yeah.
keep them coming, and they want to keep them buying stuff and you like partying, because cartels also invest their money in nightclubs, in bars, in hotels. They are very intertwined with the Mexican economy.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I guess not surprising given the circumstances. But yeah, wow. So I mean, when it comes to traveling in Mexico in general, are there, would you say that Mexico in general, are there safe places for people to go to in Mexico, or is there always potentially risks there? I mean, obviously there are some places that are less safe than others, like there is in any country, but comparative to other nations around the world, how safe is Mexico for visitors?
Well, Mexico is a big country, right? Like
Yeah,
it's not as big as the US, but it's like if you say I'm gonna travel to the US, like people would ask where, and it's not the
sure.
same saying like I'm gonna be staying, I don't know, in Detroit or like downtown San Francisco, or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
saying I'm gonna be staying in like small village outside of Nebraska, right? So
Yep, yep.
like it will change a lot depending on where you are going. Like, of course, certain parts of the country I would say are very, very dangerous. Even like for Mexican nationals, like places where I wouldn't go are, for instance, Nuevo Laredo, like places in the northeastern part of the country, like the border with the U.S. Those are places that are just like completely submerged in criminal violence, chaos. People have been like they have gotten used to like firefights taking place, being like between the cartels and between the military and the cartels every day. There are horrible things that like the media doesn't even report anymore because it has been normalized. Like it
Yeah,
has been completely normalized. But like outside from that, I would say that the fact that there are criminal actors in Mexico doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna target you as an individual or as a tourist. It's the
sure.
same everywhere in the world, and like places such as Paris. I lived for almost 5 years in France, and like Paris is, I think, like the most touristic city in the world, and it's not super safe. Like
No,
there are
no.
places where you need to pay attention, like especially at night. If you take the subway, if you go to specific suburbs, like those can be very, very like dangerous spots. I would say that in Mexico, like the same rules apply. Like if you go to Mexico City, for instance, I'm from Mexico City. I grew up there. I would say, like if you go out during the day, you walk in the streets, like usually nothing's gonna happen to you. Like you're safe. But if you go to like a shady district, like a shady neighborhood at night, and you start like drinking, or like trying to buy drugs, or you just like walk alone into a dark alley, then like
Yeah,
chances of something bad happening to you increase exponentially.
sure.
But I would say that like for the most part, uh, the country, I would say, is safe to visit. You just need to pay attention to like the spots where like the cartels are fighting against each other,
Yeah,
or fighting against the Mexican government, and usually like just like avoid those places. But aside from that, I would say like Mexico City, Cancun, Playa del Carmen, like all these resorts like are safe for 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 American tourists, for Canadian tourists, for European tourists, and also these other parts that are like maybe less popular amongst American tourists, more popular oftentimes amongst European tourists, such as like the the Yucatan Peninsula, where you have all these like fascinating like ancient cities
Yeah,
from like
yeah.
Mayan civilization. Um, like places in the north where you have like these amazing mountain ranges, like natural parks, national parks. Like there are many places that are like maybe not as well known for American tourists, but they are still, you know, like super interesting and like for the most part safe for people to visit.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. And I think, like pretty much all countries, depending on what you do and where you're going in a country, would definitely uh changes how safe your trip is going to be. So I, I know
Of
from
course.
from traveling around quite a bit that definitely could be definitely the case. And I think in the media people tend to like the only things they may hear about Mexico or another country may be the violence that goes on. And then you get this distorted view of like, okay, wow, if I go there, I'm going to die. So it's just kind of uh, the media reports typically bad news only. So that's just kind of what people kind of the impression they get, I suppose.
But you know, like I don't blame them. I'm from Mexico, and when I'm not there and I read the news,
Yeah,
sometimes when I go back, I'm scared at the beginning. I'm like, all the stuff that I've been like watching in the news and reading in
yeah,
the newspaper, like it just like makes you like it shapes your vision of like everyday life over there. And yeah, like you think that like you're gonna step off the plane and you're gonna hear somebody, you know, like shooting a gun, and you like after you know like 1 or 2 days you realize like you know like it's just like the city where I grew up, you know, like with my relatives, you know, like my friends are still here, my family is here. It's just like we're just gonna go out for a walk in the park and nothing's gonna happen. But at
right.
the beginning, one interesting anecdote like that, the news and the coverage can even shape how criminals themselves look at Mexico. During the trial of El Chapo, which is something I research for like for my different research projects. One of the witnesses who testified against El Chapo was this Chicago based gang member. And he was telling the story of how like he grew up in Chicago, and at one point he went to Sinaloa to meet El Chapo and do business with him. So the first time he went to Sinaloa, he was, you know, like invited by El Chapo to visit him in his, you know, like in one of his ranches. And in the testimony, he said like he was super scared. Like he felt like, oh my God, like what am I doing? Like this is extremely dangerous. And when he met El Chapo for the first time, El Chapo was like, so how you doing? And he said like, to be honest, I'm super scared because I always had this image of like the Mexican cartels being like, you would see like this line of people kneeling and people shooting them in the
Yeah,
head and saying like, okay, next one, and just like people being executed and like blood all over. And in the testimony, he said that El Chapo laughed at me and was like, ha ha ha, no, that's not the case. And then he paused and said like, well, sometimes it's the case when we need to do it. But you know, like he said, like for the most part, like his first visit to Sinaloa, like to actually meet El Chapo was like surprising in the sense that he thought it was gonna be like all violence and like carnage and brutality.
yeah,
And he was just like this like businessman, you know, like trying to, you know, like find an agreement to export drugs into the US with him, and he didn't see any blood or killings or torture while during the time he was actually meeting El Chapo in
yeah,
his ranch. So just go to show that, you know, like even criminals can be, you know, like can be biased by the media coverage of like how
yeah.
Mexico is.
Well, yeah, I mean, people at the end of the day, even if they're a criminal, they're going to still act like a normal person probably for much of their much of their life. Well, they'll behave just like anyone else. They'll just have a different aspect of their life where they obviously do darker things, and killing people or whatever. But um yeah, that makes sense. It is definitely a fascinating thing because you tend to, yeah, I guess, especially when viewing criminals, people kind of can dehumanize them as if there's not a human side to it. But you could meet a criminal on the street not knowing they're a criminal and think they're a normal person. And then, if you were to look into their background, you actually learn, okay, actually this person's, a murderer or something like that. It just shows that our ability to connect with other people, because we're the same species after all. So um, it's interesting. So I'm curious then, You mentioned something about organ markets in Mexico, and I've heard something about organ markets before. How common are those?
Um, I wouldn't really be able to say, and I don't think there have been thorough
Okay.
studies, and like there's not a lot of research on the market of human organs in the world in general. Like there are few, like, but especially in Mexico, I haven't really come across any, like serious studies that address this phenomenon. I know that there's a market for organs. There's a big problem of human trafficking in Mexico, where people are just, like treated as cattle, and they're just like sold, especially immigrants from South America and from Central America who cross Mexico in hopes of making their way into the United States. There is an immigration crisis right now taking place,
Yeah.
and um, oftentimes, again, like in the US, the debates around this immigration crisis are centered on, like, how is this going to affect us as American citizens? Like, are we going to see like this wave of like illegal immigrants coming here and stealing our jobs? And, like in Mexico, usually, and in Central America, the debates tend to be a little bit different. And one of the main problematic aspects in Mexico is the fact that many of these people, it's just, like young men, women, children who are like taking this journey to go like from their places of origin into the United States. When they cross through Mexico, like they don't realize how dangerous it's going to be for them, because Mexican cartels are um, deeply connected to the human trafficking industry. And when they identify like these are groups of immigrants coming here, they see them as vulnerable people who can be exploited. So oftentimes what they will do is like they will stop them literally like in the middle of the highway and say, if you want to continue, like if you want to continue your way to the US, you need to give us money. And if you
Mm,
don't give us money, then best case scenario is you can't continue your journey. But oftentimes what happens is that they will kidnap them, they will abduct them, and then they will keep them literally like stored in warehouses, and they will try to blackmail them saying, okay, now if you want to be free, like if you want to continue the journey, like you need to call your relatives back in, like Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and you need to tell them that they need to send us money, that they need to make a deposit. If they don't make a deposit, then we're just going to kill you. Sometimes they will identify people that they can exploit in different ways, such as, for instance, children and young women, and they will designate those as like those people. We're just going to keep them for exploitation. So it could be, now you're going to do the dishes, for instance. Like if you like, we're going to take you to the house of like one person who works for the cartels, and you're going to be, like working for this person all the time, kind of like an indentured servant or a
yeah.
slave. Um, or in other cases, it's they are just like designated as, like these people will be like we'll just like use them for sexual exploitation. So they either become like sex slaves for the cartels, or they are sold into, like strip clubs or brothels, and they are forced to work as prostitutes. So if you see those things taking place, like if you see the fact that a lot of immigrants end up being, like abducted and being exploited in these ways, it is also true that sometimes, like small kids will be sold for adoption. Like, oh, like you want a small baby? Like I have one. How much are you willing to pay? Oh, and like they sell them like for people who just like maybe they want to have a son, like maybe they want to have maybe they want to have a kid, or sometimes in some cases, but again, it hasn't really been researched. There have been instances of organs exploitations where it's
Yeah.
like I'm selling you for your organs.
Yeah. That's pretty crazy. Yeah. Wow. So, thinking then about in the big picture, you've obviously been studying this topic for a long time. What do you think that the governments of North America can do then to combat, this issue? What can Mexican government do, or the US government, or even the Canadian government? Because obviously this problem seems to be out of control. and it's not getting better, it seems like, at the moment. So
I had this conversation with a journalist who works for the Washington Post. And he was like about a year ago, and he asked me the same question. And I think that this would require, like, if we think of governments of North America as like including the governments of countries that signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, meaning Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And I think there would need to be a change of vision and kind of like radical change of vision, and to actually see North America as a one big region that is not just interconnected in terms of trade, but also interconnected in terms of common future and common political interests. So that would entail seeing North America kind of like how you like Europe sees itself.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
we cannot survive if we don't see each other as interdependent entities that need to cooperate more than like in many more aspects than just trade and like some other kind of like big like regulatory agendas. This needs to be like an integral cooperation and integration vision that sees ourselves like becoming more and more cooperative and becoming more and more homogenous in many aspects, such as like uh, just to give an example, like on the top of my head, like fighting climate change, or like curbing like illegal immigration, curbing drug trafficking. But this also comes with like other compromises, such as, for instance, in the case of the free trade agreement. It is true that like for decades after the signing of the first U.S. Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, um, Mexico was seen kind of like as the source of cheap labor. So U.S. companies would relocate their production, like their production factories to the U.S. to the Mexican border, and they would produce like jeans or cars or like different like different types of merchandises in Mexico, paying Mexican labor is like super low wages, like
yeah,
they would stay in poverty. And this has been seen like as something that is problematic, not just for Mexico. It's not like, okay, so like, yes, you're coming here, but like see that like our workers are not even like earning enough to survive. Now it's also seen as a problem for the US and for Canada, because like sometimes companies will say like, okay, I'm going to move to Mexico because I can pay Mexican workers much less. But then by moving to Mexico and doing that, I'm also creating unemployment in the US. I'm creating unemployment by leaving, like the people who used to work for this company here, just firing them to relocate into Mexico and hire Mexican workers whom I'm going to exploit, and I'm going to pay like a very, very like a much lower salary. A vision, like an integral vision, would need to address this kind of problems, saying like, okay, so we need this region to be competitive for companies, but at the same time, we don't want companies that move to Mexico to be creating unemployment here. We also want to ensure that companies from the US and Canada that move to Mexico pay fair wages to their workers in order to address these imbalances, so that US and Canadian companies won't have so many incentives to just like relocate. But when they do, they will also pay decent wages to their workers in Mexico, to try to make the region more homogeneous and to try to address these common problems together. But that would require like a very, very drastic change of vision in many ways, because like just
yeah,
take a look at US politics right now.
yep,
Like it's so divided, so polarized. It's almost like if the U.S. doesn't even see itself as a
yes,
country where like the states share the states, they share problems. They just there's so much polarization. Then it would be even much harder to see that like common challenges, common problems, not just in terms of the US, but in terms of the North American region. Like what's happening in the US affects Mexico, what happens in Mexico affects the US. We need to find common solutions to common problems. But in order for that to happen, first, for instance, the US would need to overcome the current context of polarizations and see itself as, okay, we need to act together to overcome common problems as a nation. And then we can also think of cooperation in terms of international cooperation to address common problems within the North American region. So I don't see that happening in the next few years, to
It,
be honest.
it's definitely gonna take time. I mean, and I think kind of one of the biggest ironies about this situation today is just that, when you think about the United States and Mexico, for example, the amount of just cultural influence Mexico has on the United States and the people of the United States and Mexico. I mean, every generation there seems to be more and more in common amongst those people. Like I don't think you can meet an American kid today that isn't influenced in some way by Mexican culture. I even just know for myself growing up, like there are words in Spanish I knew just because of the influence of Mexican culture in the U.S. And I don't know many Americans that don't grow up having a love for Mexican cuisine, or all these aspects that are constantly in the culture, not to mention just the genetic mixing between you know Mexicans and Americans. The number of Americans with Mexican ancestry, to a certain extent, is just only going to grow more and more. So the idea that we still really separate each other as countries to the point where we don't really want to work together on issues but kind of rather blame each other, it goes really against on how we've been intermixing regardless of these countries we separate ourselves in. So I do hope that at some point people kind of can see the common humanity and work together to solve these issues, because trying to deal with them as individual countries clearly isn't working right now. So
Exactly, it's not working. And like some geopolitical events have pushed, especially people, like within the business community, to realize, like how interdependent Mexico and the US are. Like the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, crisis in the Middle East, like all of this, like has made the business, like the business community, both in Mexico and in the US, realize that, well, like the world is not in great shape, but like who can we rely on? Oh, like maybe our neighbors, like.
yeah,
And there's this phenomenon of like the term is nearshoring, where uh a lot of companies that US companies in particular that used to uh produce, like they would used to like have like their factories in China and different countries, in Asian countries, are now deciding to relocate to Mexico because they see it as, like as a great advantage. Like there is stability. This is a country that we can rely on. It's not a political rival, like it's an ally,
yeah,
and it's close. And we have a lot in common. So we can relocate, we can conduct business here, we can invest in Mexico, and it's beneficial for both countries. So that's been happening recently, like, and in a way it's sad because it's the fact that the world is in such a bad shape that makes you aware that, well, like
yeah,
maybe, like I can rely on those who are like closest, at least in geographical terms, and also in the sense that Mexico and the US, like despite of their, like um discrepancies, have been allies in many aspects for
yes,
a
yeah,
very, very long time. So it's just like, okay, so if I had this like friend here for years, like why just not rely on my friends to, like overcome challenges together?
sure,
So yeah, you're totally right.
yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully things get better soon, and it'll take some time, obviously, but hopefully, hopefully progress will eventually occur. So, what are you currently researching right now?
Um, well, my research agenda has diversified a lot recently. As you know, I'm based in Montreal. I currently teach at the University of Montreal, and um, since I moved here, I decided that I was going to keep researching organized crime in Mexico and Latin America, but that I also wanted to contribute to understanding what's going on here on
Yeah,
Canadian soil. And I thought, well, like I already have this expertise on the Mexican cartels and like how the Mexican cartels operate. How can I use that to understand organized crime in Canada? So essentially, right now, I have two projects that are like focused on what's taking place within Canadian territory. One of them, it's not surprising, is focused on the activities of the Mexican cartels within Canada. So that's a problem that has been growing also, again, with the economic and political integration of the North American region. The Mexican cartels have business interests in the US, and they also have business interests in Canada.
Sure.
And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I thought, how can I put my expertise into use here in Canada? And I noticed by like doing some research here that Mexican cartels have interests in Canada, and their presence has been developing in Canada. This is like not to the same extent as their presence in the United States, but there are Mexican cartel interests in key Canadian cities such as Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto. So I talked to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to the Mounties, who said, yes, this is a problem that we're facing right now. And then I talked to the Montreal Police, and they said, yes, this is the problem that we're facing right now. There are Mexican cartel activities taking place, and we need to understand better what's going on. So if we can develop a partnership with a research, with the research department, just to conduct some, like more kind of like scientific studies that don't necessarily need to have like operational, operational applicability. Like we're not looking to like conduct an investigation that will allow us to arrest people linked to the cartels. We're just trying to understand the phenomenon. Like, why are the cartels coming to Canada? When they come to Canada, what kind of activities they develop? How do they gain the trust of local Canadian criminals to develop business, criminal affairs here in Canada? And also something that's also interesting, do Canadian criminals go to Mexico to develop their criminal interests and like to create links with the Mexican cartels? So that's one of them. Another research project is focused on the presence of organized crime groups within Canadian prisons. So the presence of organized crime groups within prisons is a problem that has been detected in many parts of the world, especially there are two countries where a lot of studies have been conducted on this phenomenon. One is the US, and the other is Brazil. Specifically in California, there have been many studies that explore the presence of organized crime groups within the Californian prison system and how organized crime groups exploit the prison system of California to advance their own criminal agenda. In Brazil, it's the same. There are very strong criminal organizations that essentially control prisons within Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and they use that control to influence what takes place outside of prison. In other countries of the world, the phenomenon is not as developed as in California and in Brazil, but you still have criminal organizations that are present within prison walls and that have some power within prison walls. This has been explored more recently in the case of the United Kingdom, for instance, where some researchers have been exploring like how do British gangs control different parts of the British prison system. And in Canada, where while there is kind of like anecdotal evidence of the presence of organized crime groups within Canadian prisons, there has been like very, very few studies conducted to explore like how does that work within Canadian prisons. So those are the two main projects that delve specifically with what's going on here in Canada. Aside from that, one research project that I find really fascinating and that I'm focusing in right now is the influence of organized crime on the police, and more specifically on Mexican police organizations. So I published an article last year that is based on my field research in Mexico, where I explore how the fact that criminal organizations infiltrate police agencies in Mexico, and more specifically police units that are supposed to fight organized crime, how does that influence like like the perspectives of those police officers who work for those units. So what I did in Mexico is that I interviewed police officers who are specialized and work in units that are specialized in the fight against organized crime, and I just talked to them about like their work, their challenges, their fears, their attitudes, and this is not something that I originally planned, but oftentimes they would start talking about like the problem of criminal organizations within the police. It's like this is not a problem of like us versus them. It's the fact that they are inside, like they're inside the house. Like criminal organizations are present within police
Yeah.
agencies. They co-opt police officers and they use police officers to provide a bunch of services. So of course, like the most like common example is I I give you a bribe and then just like you will turn a blind eye to my activities. So that kind of like that's the like the basic example of how police corruption works. But in the case of Mexico, it goes much further than that. It's sometimes the police will actually provide criminal services for the criminal organizations. For instance, in the case of El Chapo, he would outsource taking down his rivals to the federal police. So he would say, like, I don't want to put my sicarios in danger. I don't want to put my hitmen in danger. So I will ask the federal police to take down my rivals for me. Um, Oftentimes, criminal organizations will pay the police to provide security for drug shipments. So if a shipment is like crossing Mexico and a criminal organization wants to make sure that the shipment will arrive, like safe and sound to the Mexico-US border, they can hire either the police or sometimes the army to provide security, as in like bodyguards that are
Oh
like
wow.
following drug shipments and making sure that nobody steals them on the way. Uh, Sometimes they will also use the police as sources of information. Like, can I tap on your like databases, on your surveillance cameras, so I can track down like somebody that I want to track down. Like it could be rivals, it could be like drug shipments in general. So the fact that criminal organizations in Mexico have become have infiltrated the police organizations to such an extent has had a huge impact on like how Mexican police organizations operate.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's just surreal, like the world of like being a police officer in Mexico and being a police officer who works in a unit that is tasked with fighting organized crime is just it's just like working in a crazy, super dangerous environment that is very, very difficult to navigate. So I interviewed these individuals and they gave me these fascinating stories that like they could be like they could be just like stuff for a movie show, like a
Yeah.
movie or a TV show. Just to give you an example of one of the stories they told me, I interviewed this a female police officer who who was working inside this unit that was tasked with fighting organized crime. And at one point, she was approached by colleagues who said, "Okay, your team needs to cooperate with us. We're working for this criminal organization, and we need like your team to play along. We need like we need you to turn a blind eye and like to provide some services for the cartel. Um, and we really need your cooperation." And this person that I interviewed, this female police officer, she refused. She said, "No, thank you. I'm not gonna cooperate with you." Um, and what happened is that his own colleagues started plotting to have her kidnapped by the cartels to intimidate her.
Wow.
She survived only because she asked her unit to wiretap the conversations of the colleagues she suspected. So her unit was listening to the conversations his of her colleagues, and his unit members, her teammates told her, we overheard, like we intercepted this communication between other police officers, and they are plotting to have you kidnapped. But what's even crazier is that they were having problems kidnapping her because she had a team of bodyguards. So the cartel members who were supposed to kidnap her said, you know what? It's too hard. She has bodyguards. It's not going to happen. It's too complicated. Let's just kill her instead. And so they were having this discussion of whether they were going to kidnap her or they were going to just kill her because it was easier, like from a logistical standpoint. And that's how my interviewee became aware of the fact that her colleagues were discussing, like, should we just kidnap her or should we just kill her because she's not willing to play along with us? So this is just kind of like the type of, like stories that my interviewees told me. Another one, another one of the craziest stories that one of my interviewees narrated took place. It was several years ago, and he told me that his boss told him, you need to go and make this arrest. Like, you need to arrest this individual who is linked to the cartels. So he went there with his team. They arrested this person. And as they were bringing this person back to the police station, his boss called him again and said, you know what? Our detainee's mom wants to make a deal with us. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to go to the place where she asks us to meet with her, and you're not going to make a deal with her. You're going to arrest her too. And I want you to bring both the mom, who's one of the cartel members, and the son, who's also a cartel member, bring them both to the police station. So my interview said, like, that was so fishy. Like, I was like, this is not the way we operate. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, from a like tactical standpoint, it's just like, but he needed to follow orders. And he said, okay, so let's do this. Let's go to this like rendezvous point and let's arrest this other person. Of course, when he arrived to the place where he was supposed to meet the detainee's mom, a bunch of people came down from different cars, armed, and kidnapped him, my interviewee, and his colleagues. He told me they kidnapped us. They brought us to this warehouse. They kept us there for several days where they tortured us. They essentially uh, they kept us there like blindfolded, and they kept torturing us for 2 days. And after these 2 days, they one person came and said, like, okay, you need to come out. And my interviewee said, like, at that point, I was sure they were just gonna kill me right then and there. But they took me out and they said, you're under arrest. You're being accused of being the leader of a kidnapping ring. So what he found out then is that the people who kidnapped him were actually police officers who were
Wow.
working for the cartel. So he said, okay, so police officers kidnapped me, tortured me, and then accused me of being a cartel member. And then he spent 2 years in prison trying to prove his innocence. So, I mean,
Jeez.
it's just like when you're there in Mexico, like listening to these stories, it's just so surreal. And my project is to publish various articles that delve into this specific issue, this fascinating but super scary world of like police units in Mexico that fight against organized crime. I don't know how they do it. Like, to be honest, like I wouldn't be able to, like, just like from a psychological standpoint, being able to live in that environment where you can't trust anyone. It's
Yeah.
like you can't trust your colleagues, you can't trust your supervisors, you can't trust the cartels. The cartels can trust themselves. It's just like being in a world that is just like completely um absorbed in just like conspiracies and violence, and it's just crazy, but I find it fascinating. So I already published one article that focuses on that, and my goal is to publish two more articles that focus on different aspects of this very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, that is incredible and totally insane. So is there like potentially a future book maybe in the making then with all this research at some point?
Certainly, yes. Mm, Ideally, like as a researcher, like it's our dream to like publish a book
Yeah,
soon,
yeah.
but it's always takes it's a very time consuming project. So my goal is to publish a book in the upcoming years, like 2 to 3 years, that will focus more on aspects that I researched during my doctoral dissertation. um, and they would the book would delve more on everyday violence by the Mexican cartels, because we tend to assume that the cartels use violence that is always very strategic, like well planned. Like if they killed somebody, there was obviously like a strategic reason, like probably like he was a rival, or like his business was detrimental to the cartel, or he was providing information to the police. But what happens in reality is that in Mexico, the cartels have some cartels have grown so powerful and so large that what they end up doing is that they just create routines. They just
Yeah.
create, like standard operational procedures. And some of these standard operational procedures concern violence. So sometimes violent actions by the cartels will not be like very well planned strategic decisions. It's just that this is what we do every day. We do it because, like this is how we do things around here. And they don't necessarily stop to think, but wait, is it strategic? Is it helpful? Does it align with our long-term plans? It's just like if you work for a large company, you're just gonna do things that like you do because that's how the regulations work in your workplace. Like
Yeah.
you need to be here, you need to abide by certain rules. Maybe it doesn't make much sense, but like this is how we do things around here. And the cartels, some cartels at least, have adopted these kind of like routines that deal with like how do we use violence, when do we use violence, against whom do we use violence. So my book would focus on those like everyday violence aspects of the Mexican cartels.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Sounds super fascinating. And what's the best way for people to follow your work?
Well, you can follow me on Google Scholar. So I'm pretty like all my publications are listed on Google Scholar. Like that's my academic work. Otherwise, even though I'm not a huge fan of LinkedIn, I tend to publish like whenever I give an interview, or like I publish a small article that is not a scientific article. I will publish that on LinkedIn just because like that's a good way of reaching other researchers and professionals, especially in law enforcement. And otherwise, sometimes it's just like on the news. Like ever since I moved here, I've been interviewed by mainly by Canadian media, sometimes by US journalists. Um, that's curious because like I'm not very active in Mexican media ever since I moved here. It's
Yeah.
been mostly Canadian, especially French speaking journalists. Sometimes journalists from the Anglo speaking provinces, and sometimes journalists from the US.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share all your knowledge about an important topic that seems like it's going to be important for a long time to come. So,
Yes, unfortunately. I mean, fortunately for me in a way, because
yeah, it's your
keeps
research.
begging
Yeah.
that my research will have sense. But unfortunately, like
Yeah.
it's one of these topics that like you research because you can find it fascinating, even though that, like what's taking place entails a lot of, like suffering, and, like a lot of horrible things taking place in different parts of like of the country, in different parts of the US and Canada. So yeah, I mean, it's not I would say like it's not a pretty thing to research. It's not a pretty phenomenon, but it's important to do it to understand it better.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it. And yeah, definitely a fascinating topic for sure.
Thank you so much, Ben.